The morning started like any other in the small, quiet town of Riverwood. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft orange glow across the sleepy streets. Jack Dawson, a local mechanic, stretched as he woke up to the familiar sounds of his wife, Elena, bustling around the kitchen. It was a routine he had followed for years, the same old alarm clock, the same morning coffee, the same hum of the radio playing softly in the background. Jack wasn't one to crave excitement. He loved the predictability of life. It gave him a sense of control in a world that was often too chaotic for his liking. At 47, Jack had found comfort in simplicity. His shop, Dawson's Auto Repair, sat just on the outskirts of town, nestled between a dusty old gas station and a vacant lot. It wasn't much, but it was his. And that's all that mattered to him. He'd taken over the shop from his father, who had passed away years ago. It had been a steady, humble life, and that was enough. Most of the town knew Jack by name. He fixed their cars, listened to their problems, and gave them the occasional piece of advice when they needed it. In return, they trusted him, and that trust was something Jack cherished. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and at the end of the day, he could go home knowing he'd done his part to keep his small world running smoothly. But as he pulled on his faded blue overalls and stepped outside, Jack had no idea that this would be the day that would change everything. The phone rang just as Jack was stepping into his old, rusted truck. It was a call he hadn't been expecting, and it threw him off balance for a moment. The voice on the other end was familiar, though. It was Officer Rochelle, a patrol officer he'd known for years. She had called him before about fixing up old cars for the department, but this call was different. "Hey, Jack," Rochelle's voice crackled through the phone. "We need a favor. You mind coming out to look at something for us?" Jack frowned as he leaned against the truck. "What's going on, Rochelle? You know I've got a full day of work ahead of me. What do you need?" Rochelle paused for a moment, as if considering how to explain. "We found something, Jack. We think you might be able to help us out. It's a van. Old one, abandoned on the outskirts of town. It's been there for years, but we think it might be worth looking at." Jack felt a strange tightening in his chest. A van? Old, abandoned, this didn't sound like anything urgent. Still, the tone in Rochelle's voice made him hesitate. "What's the big deal? Just a junk van, right?" "I can't explain over the phone," she said. "Just trust me. Come on down when you can. It might be nothing, but I'd feel better if you took a look." Jack sighed, glanced at the clock on the dash, and shrugged. "All right, I'll swing by. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes." He hung up, still puzzled, but figured it would be a quick job. Rochelle had been known to ask him for help with old vehicles every now and then, and he was always happy to lend a hand. As he drove out of town, past the fields and familiar houses, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty road. He reached the outskirts of town, where the streets became quieter, and the buildings grew fewer and farther between. The van was parked in a small, overgrown lot, tucked behind a dilapidated fence. It looked out of place, like a relic from another time, with peeling paint and rust eating away at the metal. Jack parked his truck a little way off, as instructed, and approached the vehicle with a sense of unease. The van's windows were cracked, the tires deflated, and the once bright color had faded into a sickly yellowish hue. But there was something about it that made Jack's heart beat a little faster. It wasn't just the van, it was the way it seemed to have been sitting there, untouched, for so long. There was a stillness in the air around it, as if the van had been waiting for someone to come and open its secrets. Rochelle was standing by the van, her arms crossed as she stared at it. She looked up as Jack approached, giving him a small wave. Her face was unreadable, but Jack could see the tension in her posture. She had seen something that had made her call him in the first place. You find anything? Jack asked, trying to break the silence. Rochelle hesitated before speaking. I don't know. We've had reports about this van for years, but no one's ever really looked into it. It's been here forever, and we just decided to check it out. Jack bent down to inspect the vehicle, peering inside through the cracked windows. The inside was dark, dust-covered, and smelled stale. He tugged at the door handle. It was locked. Rochelle didn't seem surprised. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge, she said, her voice tight. Any idea why this old van's been sitting here for so long? Jack asked, trying to gauge her reaction. I don't know, she said, but something feels off about it. I'm just wondering if it's worth trying to open it. Jack was already thinking the same thing. There was no harm in checking it out. Let's take a look. Maybe the lock's busted or something. He pulled out his toolkit from the back of his truck, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Rochelle stepped back, allowing him to work. As he began fiddling with the lock, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The van was just too present. Too forgotten. He was used to seeing abandoned cars, but this one felt different. It felt like it had a story to tell, one that was waiting for the right person to uncover. After a few moments, the door creaked open. Jack swung it wide, and the inside of the van was revealed. It was just as he expected, old, covered in dust, with nothing of note to see. Jack's heart raced as he carefully studied the photos in the small metal box. Each photograph seemed to be an eerie snapshot of a mystery that had been buried in the fabric of Riverwood for years. People he recognized, old friends, acquaintances, faces that had vanished over time, all grouped together in these photos. He could feel a knot tightening in his stomach, a cold unease creeping through him as the pieces of this puzzle refused to fall into place. The first photo was of a man he vaguely remembered, Tom, a quiet local who had moved away over a decade ago. Jack had always thought Tom had disappeared because of family issues or a change of scenery, but here he was, standing alongside others Jack recognized, a woman named Sarah, who used to run the local bakery, and a young man, Michael, who had been a high school classmate. These were all people who had simply dropped out of town, never to be heard from again. Jack stared at the photo for a long time, his mind racing. Had they simply left, or was something else at play here? And why were they all gathered together in this van? What the hell is this, Jack? Rochelle's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp with both fear and confusion. What's going on? These people, they just disappeared. I mean, we've always had rumors, but now this. Jack didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to think, had to process. He slowly placed the photo back in the box and scanned the rest. Each photograph told the same unsettling story, people who had vanished without a trace, and yet here they were, frozen in time, side by side. Some were taken in the 80s, some in the early 90s, but they all had one thing in common: they were connected to Riverwood. These weren't strangers from other places, these were people who had once called this town home. He flipped through the stack of photos, each one sending a ripple of dread through his body. As he reached the last photo, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a woman he recognized instantly, Elena, his wife. Elena was standing in the middle of the group, looking directly at the camera. She was younger in the photo, in her late 20s, with the same smile that Jack had fallen in love with years ago. But the most unsettling part was the way she was looking at the camera. There was a sort of knowing in her eyes, as if she were aware of something that no one else in the photo was. It was like she was part of something much bigger than just a snapshot. And Jack's stomach twisted as he realized that she had been involved with these people, people who had disappeared without a trace. Had she known them? Had she been involved in their vanishing? Rochelle must have noticed the change in Jack's demeanor because she stepped closer, her eyes locking onto the photo. Is that She trailed off, looking back at Jack for an explanation, but he couldn't offer any answers. Elena had never mentioned these people. He had never asked, either. Why would he? They had been living their life, simple, content. There had never been any reason to question the past. But now, standing in front of this van, staring at these photographs, Jack's entire world seemed to be unraveling. He had to get to the bottom of this, but he didn't know where to begin. The van, the box, these people, there was a dark history here that had been kept hidden for far too long. What's the next step? Rochelle asked, her voice trembling. Do we go to the police with this? I mean, this is bigger than just some missing people. This van, it's like a time capsule. We have to figure out what the hell is going on before someone else gets hurt. Jack nodded, his mind spinning with possibilities. He knew they couldn't just walk away from this. It wasn't just an abandoned vehicle anymore, it was a symbol of something far darker than either of them could have imagined. We need to go back to town, Jack said slowly, his mind already racing ahead. We need to talk to some of the older folks, people who've been around long enough to know about these disappearances. Maybe there's a connection we don't see yet. Rochelle didn't argue. She understood the urgency in Jack's voice. Without another word, they locked the van back up and left the eerie lot, both feeling the heavy weight of the mystery they had just uncovered. As they drove back to town, Jack's mind kept returning to Elena. Why had she never mentioned any of this to him? Had she been hiding something from him all these years? And if so, what could it possibly be? When they arrived back in Riverwood, the town felt eerily quiet. It was as if everything had slowed down, waiting for them to make the next move. Jack pulled into his driveway, parked the truck, and got out, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his life was about to change forever. Elena was inside, as expected, preparing dinner in the kitchen. The soft sounds of her humming filled the air, and for a moment, Jack felt a pang of normalcy. But that normalcy was fleeting. He couldn't shake the images of the photographs from his mind. Elena was in those pictures, somehow connected to the mystery of the van and the people who had disappeared. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jack, what's going on? Elena called from the kitchen, sensing his unease. You look like you've seen a ghost. Jack stood at the doorway, not sure how to begin. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't go on living in ignorance. He had to confront this, had to face whatever dark truth was lurking in their past. Elena, Jack began, his voice low. I need to ask you something. It's about the van. The one we found today, on the outskirts of town. Her face changed in an instant. The bright smile she had been wearing moments before faltered, and Jack noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, something that he couldn't quite place, but it made his stomach turn. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice suddenly tense. Jack stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face. Elena, I found a picture of you in that van. A photo with a group of people I don't know. People who've disappeared from Riverwood over the years. What's going on? Her face paled. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes, the weight of a secret she had been carrying for far too long. Then, in a quiet, trembling voice, Elena spoke. Jack, I didn't want you to know. It's not something I can explain easily. But I'm not who you think I am. There's so much I haven't told you. So much that I've buried deep inside because I was trying to protect you. Jack's heart raced. He was on the edge of something huge, something that could shatter everything he thought he knew. He didn't know if he was ready for the truth, but there was no turning back now. Tell me everything, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Elena took a deep breath and began to speak, each word heavier than the last. And as she did, Jack's entire world began to shift in ways he could never have imagined. Elena's voice trembled as she began to speak, her words slow and deliberate, as if each one was a weight she had carried for far too long. Jack could feel the tension in the room, the air thick with the truth that was finally about to come out. He took a seat across from her at the kitchen table, his mind racing, trying to prepare himself for whatever she was about to say. He never imagined that their quiet, ordinary life in Riverwood would be overshadowed by something so dark and complicated. "It's not just the van, Jack," she began, her eyes darting away from his. "It's the people. The ones in the photos. I knew them, well, I didn't know them all at first, but I was part of something I was never supposed to be involved in. I thought I had put it all behind me, but it's all coming back now, and I don't know what to do." Jack sat motionless, unable to speak, waiting for her to continue. His mind couldn't make sense of what she was saying, but he knew, deep down, that what was coming would be the unraveling of everything they had built together. "There's a group, Jack. A group that I got involved with when I was younger, before we met," Elena said, her voice breaking. "They were involved in some shady stuff. Things that were hidden from everyone. The van, the people, it was all connected. And I was part of it." Jack could feel the anger rising inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Shady stuff? Elena, what are you talking about? What was this group? Why didn't you tell me?" She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to say what she knew would change everything. "It started when I was in college. There was a man, his name was Greg, he was the leader of the group. He wasn't someone who stood out, but he had this magnetism. People followed him. I didn't know it at first, but he had a plan. A plan to take something that didn't belong to him, something that would change the course of everything. It was bigger than just a few people. It was about control." Jack's mind swirled with confusion and disbelief. "Control? What does that even mean, Elena? What could you have possibly been involved in?" Her face tightened, the weight of the past pressing on her shoulders. "It was about money, Jack. Money and power. It was a network, a way to move things without anyone noticing. They stole things from people, from families. But they didn't just steal physical things. They stole lives, Jack. They ruined people. And I was part of it. I was used, I guess. I didn't know how deep it all went until it was too late. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already in too deep to get out." Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard rumors of shady dealings, even some whispers of things happening in the background of Riverwood, but he never imagined that Elena, the woman he loved, the woman who had been his partner for so many years, was involved in something like this. "So the people in the van? They were involved with this group?" Elena nodded slowly. "Yes. They were all part of it. The ones who disappeared, they were the ones who had outlived their usefulness. Some of them tried to leave, others didn't know when to stop. Greg couldn't afford loose ends. He made sure people disappeared. People I knew, people who meant something to me at the time, they were all gone, just like that. I didn't know where they went or what happened to them, but I knew it was him. I knew he had done something to them." Jack's mind reeled. "And you didn't tell me? All these years, you didn't say anything?" "I couldn't, Jack," she whispered, her eyes filled with regret. "I was scared. If I had told you, you would have asked questions. And Greg didn't like questions. He controlled everything, even the people around him. I was afraid if I told you, you'd be dragged into it. I thought I could leave it behind, move on, but I couldn't. And then, when we got married, I thought it was over. I thought I was free." Jack's heart ached as he listened, but anger burned through him, too. "So you lied to me all these years? You kept this secret? What else are you hiding, Elena? I didn't want to hide anything from you, Jack, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to protect you. I thought I was protecting us both, but now it's all coming back. The van, the people, they're part of a bigger picture, a picture that we can't ignore. Greg's network didn't end when I left. He's still out there, Jack. And so are the people who were involved. Jack's thoughts raced as the pieces began to fall into place. But the van, why did it turn up now? After all these years? Why are we getting dragged into this? Elena's expression darkened. I don't know. But I have a feeling it's not a coincidence. There's something else, something we haven't seen yet. If that van is back in Riverwood, it means someone is still looking for answers. Someone who might want us to be a part of their plan, or someone who's trying to erase the past once and for all. Jack's mind was spinning. Elena had been part of something far darker than he could ever have imagined. And now, it seemed like the consequences of that past were crashing down on them both. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. There was no way he could walk away from this now, not after everything Elena had told him. Elena, he said, his voice low but firm. We need to find out who's behind this. We need to figure out what they want. And we need to make sure no one else gets hurt. She nodded, her eyes filled with fear and determination. I know. I don't know what they'll do if they find out I've told you, but I don't care anymore. We can't keep running from this. It's time to face the truth, no matter how ugly it is. With that, Jack stood up, his resolve solidifying. He had always thought Riverwood was just a small, quiet town, until now. Until the van, the people, the secrets. The past was never really gone, just buried, waiting to resurface. And as much as he wished he could go back to the life they once had, Jack knew that wasn't an option anymore. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. They needed to find out what had happened to the missing people, to the van, and to the dark force that had been pulling the strings all these years. Jack didn't know what dangers lay ahead, but he was ready to face them. Whatever came next, he would protect Elena, and he would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, Riverwood had a secret and Jack was determined to find it. As they prepared to leave the house, Jack glanced at Elena. Her face was a mixture of fear and courage, but there was something else, too, a spark of determination. He knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And somehow, in that moment, he realized that their ordinary life was gone. The mystery of the van and the people who had vanished had already started to change everything, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jack and Elena drove through the winding streets of Riverwood, the tension in the air so thick it felt suffocating. Elena's hands gripped the seat, her knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Jack tried to focus on the road, but the nagging thoughts swirling in his mind made it almost impossible to concentrate. What was this about? How had they gotten wrapped up in something so sinister? A quiet, peaceful town like Riverwood shouldn't have secrets like this, but the truth was undeniable. They were being pulled deeper into a web of mystery, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. The van. The people who had disappeared. The group Elena had been involved with years ago. It all seemed like a nightmare come to life. Jack had hoped their life together would be untouched by the dark shadows of the past, but here they were, heading straight into it, whether they were ready or not. Elena sat next to him, her eyes distant, as though she were bracing herself for something terrible. Jack, I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice laced with anxiety. I never wanted you to find out like this. It's all too much. Jack reached over and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I'm not going to leave you. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. I just wish we could go back to the way things were, she said softly. Before all of this. Before the van. Before everything. Jack glanced at her briefly, then refocused on the road. I know, he said, his voice steady. But right now, the only way forward is to find out the truth. And we have to do it before whoever is behind this catches up with us. If they're still out there, watching, we can't wait any longer. He could feel her nod in agreement, even though it was clear that she didn't want to face what was coming next. They drove in silence for a while, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours as they made their way to the old storage facility on the outskirts of town. This was where the van had been found. This was where their lives had started to unravel. Jack had no idea what they would find, but he couldn't back out now. As they approached the gates of the facility, Jack slowed the car, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The place was eerily quiet. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time, a relic of the past that no one thought about anymore. But now, it felt like the epicenter of everything that had been hidden away, like a time bomb waiting to explode. They parked near the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The building loomed in front of them, dark and foreboding. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what they would find once they stepped inside, but one thing was certain, things were never going to be the same. Elena hesitated before getting out of the car, her eyes locked on the facility in front of them. Jack, what if we're making a mistake? What if we should just turn back? Jack turned to her, his expression resolute. We can't go back, Elena. We've already opened this door. We have to know what's behind it. We have to know who did this and why. I'm not leaving without answers. With a deep breath, Elena nodded. She knew he was right. They couldn't turn back now, not after everything that had happened. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but they both knew there was no choice but to keep moving forward. They stepped out of the car and approached the building, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The metal door to the facility creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit interior. Jack's eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of abandoned storage units, each one looking as if it had been untouched for years. The smell of old paper and rusted metal filled the air, and a shiver ran down Jack's spine. The place felt like a tomb, a forgotten place where secrets were buried and left to fester. Stay close, Jack said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on them, but he refused to let fear take hold. They had come this far, and they were going to see it through. As they made their way deeper into the facility, Jack's eyes flicked over the old, rusting storage units. Everything looked abandoned, untouched. But there was something about this place, something off, that made his skin crawl. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional distant noise that made them both jump. The feeling of being watched was palpable, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn further into a trap. Finally, they reached the end of the row of storage units, where a large steel door stood, slightly ajar. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong among the other dilapidated units. Jack approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the door handle. His heart pounded in his chest, his nerves on edge. What was on the other side? What would they find? He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes immediately locking onto the sight inside. It was a small room, filled with rows of cardboard boxes, old furniture, and forgotten belongings. But in the center of the room was something that made Jack's blood run cold, a table, covered in papers, photographs, and maps. A chair was pushed aside, as if someone had just left in a hurry. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, but what caught Jack's eye were the photos. The same photos he had seen earlier, the ones of the people who had disappeared. Elena, Jack said, his voice barely a whisper as he took a step toward the table. These are the people from the van. The ones who vanished. What the hell is going on here? Elena's face paled as she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out for the photos. She picked one up, her eyes scanning it quickly. They're the people from the group. They were part of it. They were the ones who were supposed to disappear. But this is different. This isn't just a few missing people. This is something bigger. Jack's stomach churned as he looked over the photos and maps. It was like a puzzle, but one that didn't make any sense. There were names written in the margins, dates, and locations, details Jack couldn't quite make out. But what struck him was the connection to Riverwood. The van. The people who had been involved. This wasn't just about a group of criminals, this was about something far more sinister, something that had ties to their town, to their lives. Elena, we need to get out of here, Jack said urgently, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the table. This is bigger than we thought. We're not safe here. We need to go to the police. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Someone else was here. Someone who didn't want them to leave. Elena, get behind me, Jack hissed, his heart racing. He pushed her toward the door, but before they could make it, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The light flickered above them, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized the full scope of what they had just uncovered. They were no longer just uncovering a past mystery, they were in the middle of something dangerous. And someone was coming for them. Who's there? Jack called, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at his chest. He could hear the sound of movement, footsteps echoing, getting closer. The tension in the room was unbearable, and for the first time, Jack felt a true sense of dread. This was no longer about finding answers, it was about survival. The room seemed to close in on them, the darkness swallowing them whole. The sound of footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Then, the voice came, a low, gravelly voice that sent chills down Jack's spine. You shouldn't have come here, the voice said. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, his fists clenched. Who are you? What do you want? The figure emerged from the shadows, and Jack's blood ran cold. It was a man, someone he didn't recognize. But the look in his eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. This was someone who had been waiting for them, someone who had known they would come. And now, they were trapped. The figure that stepped out from the shadows was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, but there was something in his posture that spoke of authority, a kind of quiet menace that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. His eyes were hard, unblinking, and when they locked onto Jack's, it was as if everything else in the room disappeared. The air felt heavier, thick with the unspoken threat that lingered in every corner of the room. You shouldn't have come here, the man repeated, his voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that left no room for negotiation. Jack's heart pounded, the weight of the situation settling like a boulder in his chest. He could feel Elena's presence behind him, her breath quick and shallow as she clutched his arm, her fear palpable. We don't want any trouble, Jack said, his voice steady, though his pulse was racing. He needed to buy time, to figure out what was happening, and most importantly, how they could escape. The man didn't move, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. It was almost as if he were trying to read him, trying to figure out their next move. Jack held his ground, but his mind was racing. This was no ordinary thug, no random criminal. This was someone who had been waiting for them, someone with a plan. Trouble, the man scoffed, his lips curling into a cruel smile. No, this is much bigger than trouble. This is about something far more important. He stepped closer, his boots making a faint echo on the concrete floor. You've already seen too much. Now, the question is, what are you going to do about it? Jack's mind was spinning. Every part of him screamed to run, to drag Elena out of this hellhole and get to safety, but the cold reality settled in. There was no way out. Not unless they had answers. Not unless they uncovered the truth of what was happening here. He glanced at Elena, her face pale but determined, and he knew she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about protecting her, and about making sure whatever this man had planned didn't destroy them both. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, his voice firm, masking the unease that threatened to crack through. "We just came here to find answers. We're not part of whatever it is you're involved in. Just let us go." The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward, his shadow swallowing Jack whole. "Oh, you're already part of it. You've been part of it from the moment you stepped into that van. You've seen the faces, the people, the ones who are lost, just like you're about to be." A chill ran down Jack's spine, and for a moment, his mind blanked. The mention of the van, the people who had disappeared, it all came flooding back. It wasn't just an innocent mystery they had stumbled upon. This was a network, a web of connections that went far deeper than they could have ever imagined. And now, it seemed they were caught right in the center of it. "What are you talking about?" Elena asked, her voice shaking but resolute. "What happened to those people? Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The man finally stopped moving, standing just a few feet away from them now, the weight of his presence pressing down on them. He tilted his head slightly, as though contemplating the best way to explain something he had known for far too long. "You think this is about some random missing persons case, don't you? Some group of people who just disappeared one day? No. This is about power. Control. The things that the world doesn't want you to see. The things that people like you, people who think they're safe in their little towns, don't realize are happening right under their noses." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He could feel Elena's grip tighten on his arm, the fear in her eyes reflecting his own. The man's words made everything more real, more dangerous. This wasn't just a random act of violence, some unsolved mystery. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme, one that stretched beyond Riverwood, beyond anything they could have ever imagined. The man continued, his voice growing colder, more detached. "You've been asking questions, poking around in places you shouldn't be. You've disturbed something that's been carefully concealed for years. People have gone missing, yes, but they're not gone. Not in the way you think. They've been repurposed. They've been changed. And now, you're part of that plan. Whether you want to be or not." Jack's stomach turned. "Repurposed?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell does that mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at Jack, a cold smile flickering at the corners of his lips. "You'll understand soon enough. In fact, I think you'll come to see things my way. It's already too late for you, for both of you. You've seen the truth, and now there's no going back." The room felt even smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around them. Jack's mind raced. He had to think. He had to come up with a way out, a way to protect Elena, to stop whatever this man had planned. But everything he thought of seemed futile. They were trapped in a corner, with no way to escape. And then, something unexpected happened. The man's phone rang, breaking the heavy silence in the room. It was a sound that cut through the tension like a blade, and for a moment, Jack thought he might get some relief, some distraction to buy them time. But when the man answered, his tone was as cold and calculated as before. "Report," the man said curtly, his voice devoid of emotion. There was a long pause, as though the person on the other end of the line was speaking. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the man's expression darkened. "Understood," he finally said, hanging up the phone with a decisive snap. Jack's heart raced again. What was going on? What did the man just learn? The sudden change in the man's demeanor didn't bode well. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned his eyes back to Jack and Elena. Looks like we've run out of time, he said, his voice almost playful now, as though everything up until this point had been some sick game to him. But don't worry. You'll understand soon enough. The rest of your life will be very informative. Before Jack could react, the man raised a hand, signaling for something. And that's when the doors burst open, flooding the room with blinding light. Shadows moved quickly, and Jack barely had time to react before several armed figures stormed in, surrounding them on all sides. They moved with precision, their presence overwhelming, their weapons drawn. Jack instinctively stepped in front of Elena, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no way out. No escape. They were surrounded, trapped. And the man, the one who had been speaking to them, stood back, his face an emotionless mask. "This is where your journey ends," the man said, his voice now carrying a weight that made Jack's blood run cold. "But it's also where it begins for you. You'll learn the truth soon enough. And when you do, you'll wish you'd never asked." The air in the room felt thick with tension, and Jack knew, without a doubt, that nothing would ever be the same again. The secrets, the lies, they were no longer hidden in the shadows. They had been dragged into the light, and now, there was no way out. The man was right. They were part of something much bigger than they had ever imagined, and there was no turning back. The truth was about to unfold, and it would change everything. The stakes were higher than they could have ever realized, and the consequences of their actions were only just beginning to surface. As the armed figures closed in, Jack's mind raced. What was their next move? What could they possibly do in a situation like this? They were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no one to save them but themselves. And so, as the figures circled them, ready to make their move, Jack could only think of one thing: survival. Would they make it out of this alive? Would they be able to uncover the truth behind the van, the people who had disappeared, and the man who had now marked them as targets? Only time would tell. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood, trapped, surrounded by cold, calculating figures, their weapons trained on him and Elena. The silence in the room was deafening, every second stretching out into an eternity. The harsh, unforgiving lights above made everything feel sterile, inhuman. His pulse raced, and he could hear the beat of it pounding in his ears. He had always thought he could handle pressure. After all, he'd been through worse, hadn't he? But now, as they stood there, in the middle of this nightmare, Jack wasn't so sure. The man with the hood stepped closer, his steps deliberate, slow. His face remained hidden in the shadow of his hood, but Jack could feel his eyes boring into him, searching, analyzing. He had no idea what game this man was playing, or why they were suddenly the center of it. The van, the missing people, everything had come to this moment. And everything about it felt wrong. "You're too far in now," the hooded man said, his voice calm and chilling, like a doctor delivering bad news. "There's no way out for either of you. Do you understand that? You've seen things that most people wouldn't even dream of. People like you don't walk away from this." Elena's grip on Jack's arm tightened, her fingers cold, but her presence was a small comfort. He could sense her fear, but also her determination. She wasn't going to back down. They weren't just going to roll over and accept whatever twisted fate these people had in store for them. She hadn't come this far just to be another casualty. Neither of them had. "Why us?" Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What do we have to do with any of this? We just wanted to understand." "Understand?" The hooded man interrupted, laughing bitterly. "You think you can just waltz into a situation like this and understand it? No, Jack. People like you never understand until it's too late. You've stumbled into something far darker than you could have ever imagined. This isn't some conspiracy theory, some crime ring. It's much bigger than that. You're dealing with people who control things. People who The sound of a phone ringing broke through the man's monologue, cutting the air like a knife. The man's face soured, and for a moment, his previously calm demeanor faltered. He turned abruptly, stepping away to answer the call. Jack couldn't help but notice the flicker of annoyance in the man's posture. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, as if something was out of his control. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to give Jack a glimmer of hope. Maybe they weren't as trapped as they seemed. Maybe there was a crack in this otherwise impenetrable wall. As the man answered the call, Jack turned his attention to Elena, his gaze meeting hers. Her eyes were wide, full of terror, but also defiance. It was as if, in this moment, they both realized that they didn't just have each other to fight for, they had something bigger. Something worth protecting. There was no going back now, not when the stakes were this high. What do we do? Elena whispered, her voice low, urgent. Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. The odds were against them, no question. But he couldn't give up. Not yet. Not after everything they'd been through to get this far. There had to be a way out. He just had to find it. Then the man hung up, the sound of the receiver slamming back into place echoing in the room. He turned to face Jack and Elena, his expression now hard, his eyes like ice. It seems we're not the only ones who've been watching, he said, a note of disdain in his voice. Looks like your little adventure has attracted the attention of some very important people. And they're not happy. The tension in the room skyrocketed. The air felt thicker now, heavier. Jack didn't know who the important people were, but he could tell that whatever it wasn't good. It was bad enough that they had crossed paths with these people, but now, apparently, they were on the radar of people far more dangerous. We don't want any part of this, Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. We just want to leave. No one needs to get hurt. The hooded man gave a short, humorless laugh. You've already been hurt. You just don't realize it yet. You're tangled up in something far bigger than you can comprehend. And there's no going back. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let Elena get swept up in whatever this was. He couldn't let this man's words define their future. There had to be a way out, a chance, even if it was small. He thought about the things they had uncovered, the van, the missing people, the unsettling truths about how deep the darkness ran in their town. Maybe it wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe it was about stopping these people, about bringing this conspiracy into the light. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the answer struck him. We don't have to understand everything, Jack said, the words coming out stronger than he'd expected. But we can stop it. We can stop you. The man's eyes narrowed, but there was no fear in his expression. You don't understand, do you? You're too late. No, Jack said, his voice firm. We're not too late. We're just getting started. The words hung in the air for a moment before the man let out a heavy sigh. You're playing a dangerous game, he warned, almost pityingly. But I admire your courage. Too bad it won't save you. Suddenly, there was a movement behind Jack. He turned just in time to see one of the armed figures take a step forward. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he moved that didn't sit right with Jack. His gut told him that the situation was about to escalate, fast. Without thinking, Jack grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her toward the nearest exit. He had no plan, no strategy, just an overwhelming need to survive. He couldn't let them be taken. Not like this. Not after everything they had discovered. The armed figure lunged forward, but Jack was faster. He shoved Elena toward the door, his heart pounding, his instincts taking over. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, but Jack didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to waste time. He had to keep moving, keep running. They barreled through the door and into a narrow hallway, the harsh light of the fluorescent bulbs overhead making their surroundings feel even more claustrophobic. Jack's thoughts were a blur, his breath ragged as he tried to think of a way out, a way to escape the suffocating grip of the men chasing them. Elena's hand was still tightly clasped in his, her grip just as strong as his own. She wasn't going to give up. They were in this together. But then, something caught Jack's eye. A shadow darted down the hall ahead of them, moving too quickly to be a person. It was large, dark, and it moved with an unnatural grace. For a split second, Jack thought he saw something in the shadows, a flash of red, perhaps, or something else entirely. But then it was gone. Jack! Elena gasped, pulling him back. What was that? What was that thing? I don't know, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. But we have to keep going. We can't stop. Just as they turned another corner, they found themselves facing a set of double doors. Without hesitation, Jack pushed them open, and they burst into the next room, a disorienting rush of sound and movement. The room they had entered was filled with computers, monitors, and cables, an underground operation, far more sophisticated than anything they had imagined. But it wasn't the technology that caught Jack's attention. It was the people. Dozens of faces turned toward them, and for a moment, Jack thought they had walked into the heart of the conspiracy. But then, to his shock, one of the figures stood up, an older man with a tired face, and smiled. "We've been waiting for you," he said softly, his eyes filled with something Jack couldn't quite place. "It's time to finish what you started." Jack's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore. They had walked into the lion's den, but maybe, just maybe, they had found allies in the most unexpected of places. The game had changed. And this time, Jack wasn't going to let anyone control the outcome.